So, now it should be the symbol like we are live, but I have to share the link with my team. Okay. So I think we are ready, Ryan. I will give the introduction and then let's start. Hi and welcome everybody to the ISP Insights Podcast. I'm your host, Thorsten Schmidt, and today I am glad to have Ryan Jeffery with me in the show. We will speak about OSS in general, and we will speak about your book, Ryan, and we will speak about passionate about OSS and the future of OSS. But for all the listeners, Ryan, who do not know you, I've got two questions. First of all, who are you? And maybe for the listeners who are not comfortable with the name OSS, what is OSS?
Yeah. So great philosophical question to start off with there. Who am I? So I guess I identify as an engineer initially, founder, but also someone who's really passionate about communications, technologies, networks, and not so much in terms of the comms, the tech, the networks themselves, but they're more of a means to an end, but their ability to achieve outcomes that have changed the world really over the last decades. And so OSS is a big part of that play as well. So OSS stands for Operational Support Systems. And to use an analogy there, it's a bit like a conductor is to an orchestra. So an orchestra has many instruments that all go and need to be coordinated to produce a valuable song. Same in the comms industry. So an OSS is really the conductor that orchestrates, that pulls together the people, the processes, the technologies. And I guess when we're talking about all of those things and why they need to be coordinated, we're talking about people that organizations can have tens of thousands of people, that from field workforce to the people inside finance, engineering, design. There's so many aspects in terms of the networks, potentially tens of thousands of devices, millions of customers. They all need to be orchestrated, and OSS are the tools that help to the conductor to bring all that together to make an efficient operation.
Yeah, and Ryan, when did your journey start? Like, was it in the university, or was it like your first job that brought you into the OSS, into the operator business, or when really start your passion about what we are talking about now?
Yeah, bear with me a sec. I've just had a pop up that's getting in my way. Yeah, so I guess the passion for OSS started on the very first project. So back in 2000, I was dragged, literally kicking and screaming. The company I was working for back then had this big project over in Taiwan, and I was quite happy with life here in Australia and all the things I was doing, the projects I was doing. But they dragged me across to Taiwan, and it was a $30 million OSS project for a new tier one telco. And it turned out to be so fun. They initially only sent me over for a month or two, and that ended up becoming something like 6 of the next 8 years I spent overseas working on tier one telco projects, implementing OSS. And I guess part of the reason that I found that really interesting is I was completely out of my depth, and yet somehow most of the things just conceptually seemed to click. And I guess part of that was having done an engineering degree, having done a computer science degree, doing databases and networks and all of the pieces of the puzzle that go into making an OSS. I guess I was finding somewhat intuitive, exciting, and the pieces seemed to fit. Whereas quite a few of my colleagues, like I had one guy I was working alongside, was brilliant guy. He previously managed something like 500 people in a tier one telco, and he was struggling to see where all the pieces fit. And it was probably, yeah, that university tie-in, like you talked about, that helped perhaps pick up some of that. But gee, I also remember just how out of my depth I was on that first project. It was really, really overwhelming, and I've learned a lot along the way, but it's still out of my depth. The tiniest little tip of the iceberg about this industry. There's still so much to learn. So many people to speak to that you'll still learn from. So yeah, that's I guess where some of the passion arose.
Yeah, that is great. I really can imagine how complex the OSS topic was back then, and I mean today it's even like a very big and complex topic. I mean, you speak about that the telcos have many different teams that need to be organized, many different software solutions, and different technologies, and everything needs to fit together. Let's call it in the name OSS and BSS. So this is really a large topic. And I mean, for many, I think executives, it's maybe not a passion. It's like the messy room, which they are avoiding to look in, because every time they get into the OSS part, it's there's also, like you mentioned, the complexity and also trouble involved while migrating from one OSS to another, or having like different systems involved. So yeah, now you have started like several years ago, the passionate about OSS. How was this transition happening? So you said you started with the first OSS project, takes several years, was really a huge project, several millions. What was the next step on your journey towards passionate about OSS?
Yeah. So I might even take a step back into the comment there about the execs, and I think a big part of that is because many people see OSS as a cost center. So it's just something that costs them money and it's not really adding value. And I see that as probably a failing of us collectively, that we see the operations in OSS and envisage that these things are just tools for operational people and that they're just operational support, where really I sort of see them as being far more valuable than that. So the value to an organization, that's as OSS experts or implementers or whatever it may be, have to come up with better ways of persuading and just showing how valuable these tools are. And so that's, for example, putting it into the context of a CFO. So how are we adding value to a CFO? And that could be things through how we're managing assets, but also how the whole process of using an OSS activates orders faster. So therefore it's faster time to market, faster turn on of revenue. So turning it into things that are valuable to more than just the operational people. And yeah, I see that as a real failing from most of us, and something that I try and get across with Passionate About OSS and the books and the blogs and the things that you alluded to earlier. So in terms of making that transition to running it as a business, so as I talked about earlier on, the first project was I was working with a consulting company, so specializing in IT and telecommunications, and through them and through that first OSS vendor doing that project, that allowed me to go to places like, so the first one was Taiwan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, India. So all of these different places I'm working on really big tier one telco projects that they were all encompass, so really broad breadth of OSS and BSS as well. So they were covering alarms performance, inventory, discovery, traffic engineering, outside plant, all of the different facets, but also crossing into BSS. So BSS being into the CRM and service order management, provisioning, activations, all of these things. So it was a great introduction to just seeing how far and wide these tools impact. So I guess that was the next 6 to 8 years was doing that. And after that, I kind of came back and was doing a number of just other telco projects. So at one point, I was leading a program. So it was about $150 million program. So a pretty big piece of work, but it didn't have much OSS to it. And I was finding that as big as it was and as interesting as it was and as challenging as it was, it just wasn't getting the passion for probably the first time in my career that I just hadn't been passionate about what I was doing. And so on the side, I started developing the blog, so to just kind of talk about the OSS industry. That led to, after writing a number of blog posts, it sort of led towards turning some of that content into the book that you kindly showed earlier on. And from that, I guess it just kept building over the years. And I was working with a number of different consulting firms through that period, and many different clients, like some of the big tier ones in Australia and Asia. And eventually the side business, the blog, the book, was kind of generating an inquiry or an opportunity a week. And so I was struggling to support both the day job as well as trying to do the night job as well. And it got to the point of probably about 2 to 3 years ago where it was pretty much a self-sufficient business, and jumped across to just doing the passionate about OSS as a consulting. So the name itself is probably there's pros and cons to such a complex business name, but it all stemmed from the passionate about OSS blog, and so I just kind of kept it.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the book. It's called Mastering Your OSS. I will read it over the holiday. So, but I've started to looking into it, and where I really came across that it's amazing is the first thing that I saw was I looked into the summary, and you started the summary with a quote from the Intel founder Andy Grove, and that is where I really feel okay. There's a connection between us. So I'm really a big fan. I'm really a big fan, not only of OSS but also of Intel. And yeah, the book. So you have written the book in which year was it? 2000 and
Yeah, so I think 2014. There's probably been a few minor updates since then. Yeah, I guess probably about a year ago I started writing an update. But to kind of go back a little bit, the purpose of the book, I was finding that speaking to many different customers, it was often the same kind of questions that kept popping up, and particularly from the smaller customers. So the big tier one telcos, they've got lots and lots of experts already on the books. They know a lot about OSS, and they've done a lot of OSS projects. So this was, yeah, I found the same sort of questions kept popping up. So the idea behind this book was to not so much cover the really technical aspect of OSS and BSS, because as we know, those technologies are changing, the networks are changing, the processes are changing, the underpinning database models and other IT technology is all changing. So you write a book like that and it's out of date within months. In fact, by the time you publish, it's probably a lot of the content was out of date. So the idea behind this book was to try and make it a bit more evergreen. So more to cover a lot of those big questions and that companies tended to be asking, and to cover it in a way that was probably longer lasting. So not going into specifics about, I don't know, so some of the technology stacks that may have been around back in 2014, because there's no doubt they would have been out of date, but some of the methodologies that I apply. So I guess that's one of the challenges with OSS, and you would have experienced it with NMS Prime, is every project is so vastly different from every other one because you're dealing with different networks and different processes, org charts, etc. So there's not a lot of repeatability. So I guess I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about how to design methodologies, how to build repeatability. Because once you can build a repeatable model, you can look to refine it, improve upon it. Whereas most OSS projects, because there's no repeatability, there's no continual improvement, apart from just organic growth of the people and the tools that you're using.
So the book is really about how somebody should have a perspective on the OSS topic, how you can plan, how you can involve it, and what are the methodologies behind these kind of thoughts and your experiences from the industry. And I have came across your website, Passionate About OSS, while searching some of the topics, and I saw, oh, this is really great, Passionate About OSS, and I saw there are a lot of blog posts. So how many blog posts are there actually available now? So we are now in December 2020, maybe for the viewers who are, or the listeners who are listening a little bit later. So how many blog posts are available, Ryan?
Yeah, so I think it's just within the last month or two that I've passed 2,500 articles written there on Passionate About OSS. So this year, I guess I've been diving into some other projects that's taken me away from writing blogs as much. But in the early days of starting Passionate About OSS, it was every business day pretty much for many years writing a blog post. So the great thing about that was making that commitment to write an article a day meant that I had to go out and look at what the market was doing and the technologies, the principles, speak to different people about how they tackle the many problems that we face as OSS aficionados.
Yeah, I mean 2,500. This is amazing. It's a lot of work and a lot of great posts. I have read some of them. So really a great work that you are doing here. Maybe let us jump to some of the projects that you've also kicked off, which is like the OSS Sandpit project. And I have found that you also share like what would you call it, like a register for all the different solutions which are available in the OSS segment. So yeah, OSS Sandpit, what is it?
Yeah, so the OSS Sandpit was probably a concept I came up with 4 or 5 years ago to like I still remember so vividly that first project and how out of my depth I was and how little support there was because projects tend to be so specific. So even speaking to experts in the field, there wasn't really that general repository of knowledge. And yeah, so I guess part of the OSS Sandpit comes about because of those major barriers to entry for anybody coming into the market. So part of it is the body of knowledge. So I guess to an extent, by doing the blog posts and the pages and papers on Passionate About OSS, it's covering some of that body of knowledge. But one of the other big barriers to entry to somebody starting in the OSS industry is unless you work for a telco or unless you work for one of the OSS vendors, you just can't touch and feel an actual OSS. So you might say read the book or read an article, but until you actually get to play with those tools, it's pretty hard to put context to it. And a majority of those systems so the telcos are probably spending at least $500,000 and usually plus going up into the hundreds of millions of dollars to build these systems. They're taking months to put together and big teams to put together. So the question was how to build that sandpit and particularly and put it in the hands of individuals that they could easily access and easily play with. And obviously not individually, we don't necessarily have $500,000 to spare to go and just build an OSS to play around with. So, but there are lots and lots of open source projects out there. So that idea from 4 or 5 years ago was to get a bunch of different open source projects bring them together, show the kind of tutorials or how the pieces fit together. But probably more important too is to actually show some of the use cases, the scenarios, the data sets that actually show what an OSS does or how it can be set up. So NMS Prime that you look after is on the list to have a really close look at, and in future posts I hope to be able to demonstrate that as part of the Sandpit. But one of the other tools, probably the key linchpin I feel within OSS, is around the logical and physical inventory, because everything kind of ties back into the resources that you've got in the network. And up until probably around a year ago, I just wasn't aware of that middle piece of the puzzle that the OSS Sandpit could be built around, because pretty much every other product I was aware of in the market is $500,000 and up. But yeah, I came across earlier this year a project that's actually been around for 10 years. So I'm a bit staggered that I missed it, but a project called Kawaiba, and it's got a physical network inventory, logical network inventory. It also ties in customer services and a number of different really important aspects around what an OSS BSS is. And I guess you also touched on the Blue Book OSS BSS vendor directory. So I spent quite a lot of time looking at the market, and I think there are over 400 different vendors out there, so a highly fragmented market. But I also spend quite a bit of time looking out for keeping the radar up for new OSS and BSS projects. So the fact that I hadn't found Kawaiba in amongst the other 450 or so entries was a bit staggering. And similarly, NMS Prime, you've been around and been working on some fantastic tools, and yet I guess I'd only found out about you just within the last few months as well. So yeah, had a look, and yeah, really looking forward to playing around with the tools in more detail in the near future, because I see like it really fills a gap in some of those open source type tools of trying to build the Sandpit into a more fully functional OSS for people to get their hands on and play with, and yeah, take some of those use cases that I've set up and play around with some data.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the same idea which was concerning me, like starting with the OSS topic 10 to 15 years ago, that I always was wondering, why isn't there an open source solution available for let's call it small and mid-sized operators, who fits all together of the pieces. And that was actually one of the reasons why I thought that there are so many great solutions available for monitoring, for real-time detection, for DHCP, for everything that you need, but nobody makes the work to put it together. And I was always wondering, of course, I did not know that you have already the register to scroll down and search all the projects. But like you said, there are so many projects, it's hard to have an overview. So then I was starting, okay, out of my first experience with a network, or with founding my own network operator, was really that the OSS topic after some years was turning what I would say more into a nightmare, because we have many different pieces of the system, and it gets complexer and complexer and complexer, and more expensive also from OPEX point of view. And that was one of the reasons why I said, okay, if the system that I would like to have should look like open source in many perspectives. And that was one of the reasons why I started to have a look at the different parts of the puzzle and what are the best open source solutions, and trying to combine them. And of course, there are a lot of great companies around, and I really appreciate to have your work here, to see what are the companies and what are the projects working on it. And I think also an important change that you mentioned is in the last years, or maybe a question, Ryan, the open source movement is also involving in the topic. I mean, open source was really successful at the let's call it operating system parts, or more like Red Hat is and Linux and all the. I mean, the internet wouldn't be the same without open source. I guess 80% of the stuff is running on open source, and that was also where I was wondering, why was the OSS topic often so proprietary and not open to open source? But this is something which or is it changing? It's a question, Ryan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess part of the idea of doing some of those projects was to shine a light on all these amazing, I'll call them little projects, but literally it's people who have spent many years of their lives pulling together some of these projects. And if you look at, so having worked with quite a lot of different carriers and utilities and enterprise and seeing the way they do it, I guess the challenge is that all of them have got their own special, unique requirements, and all of them have got their own, I guess, all the bits and pieces of different projects, and they're all integrated in different ways. So different interfaces, different data models. There's so much that's different about it, and in many ways, I kind of see that as holding the industry back. So you look at, say, the hyperscalers. So you've got Google and you've got Azure and you've got AWS. So really, you've got a lot of concentration of all the skills and attention and problem solving focused on some of the really big players. Whereas when you've got, say, 400, 450 different vendors out there, a lot of them are doing duplicated effort. So as a result, all these amazing people that we've got out there effectively solving the same problem over and over again. And it's probably holding us back, but it's also doing things differently. And I guess there's no fixed way of saying, oh, you have to cut it this way, or it has to be this module, this interface. So I guess what we've had is where all these different solutions have grown up to solve particular problems for particular customers. And we haven't been all that great at just aggregating it all into a single concept. But one of the things that I guess I love about the open source movement is that it gives the people the ability for people to actually play with these systems and get to understand whether they're really adding value. So, for example, like I help quite a few companies with their vendor selection, and vendor selection can be really tricky. There are 450 vendors to choose from, but many customers just say, "Oh, well, I know these 10 or 12 or 15 companies, and these ones come and knock on my door. Let's go out and put the requirements to them." But there might actually be another really interesting project, which might be open source, might not be, that could fit those requirements. But what I guess I'd love to see is a little bit like, so for people who've built their own websites, so the kind of WordPress model where there is that kind of common platform, which maybe that's got your alarms, performance, provisioning, inventory, all these kind of pieces, your high availability modules, and using some of the open source projects like Apache, Kafka, and Spark, and all these other bits and pieces that exist. If we could bring that together and that becomes a common platform, it then allows, that's kind of solved the majority of the problems, and then we get to bring all these brilliant people to add functionality. So just like there are plugins for WordPress, and those plugins develop their own marketplace, etc. I'd love to see the same thing happen within the OSS space. But reality is there's so many OSS vendors and products out there in production, serving major purposes, bringing major revenues for telcos. It's a really hard one to try and change that and get more consolidation. But yeah, I'd love to see the open source industry take off because of the exact reasons you said. So the success the likes of Red Hat has achieved and how it's changed the world of the internet. Love to see the same sort of thing happen within that OSS space and solving those same problems, but in a really, really efficient way, and reducing the complexity and the integration tax that a lot of companies deal with at the moment.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And I would like to jump into maybe if we consider having a bigger operator who uses maybe some of the parts are open source. Maybe my first question: or Ryan, can you name a number like how many different software solutions are in a big company involved? Just that we have a picture. Is it what is the number? So a typical
Oh,
number.
hundreds, hundreds.
Hundreds of.
Yeah. So if I recall, there was one big carrier here in Australia that I think had in the order of 600 to 800 different tools, and that's probably not even considering some of the projects like a messaging bus like Kafka or whatever it might be. So that's just some of the major tools, and I guess it's some of those kind of projects that are actually changing things in that, like you were talking about earlier, Torsten, that there are a number of open source projects out there for event monitoring and things like that. But also, you're now starting to see a lot of the big players, a lot of the big telcos are starting to build their own using some of the hyperscaler tools and some of those open source tools. So it's probably I almost see it a bit like a pendulum backwards and forwards between build your own versus buy off the shelf, build your own off the shelf. So at the moment, we're probably in a little bit of a state of use some open source, but also build your own. I kind of wonder whether the pendulum will slip back towards use some of the off the shelf tools a little bit, because at the moment you've got a lot of the telcos are wanting to become IT houses in the fact that they're hiring a lot of developers to build their own. And are they a software development organization or are they a telco? And are they somewhere in the middle? So be interesting to see. Loving to watch some of the initiatives like AT&T wanting to turn their organization into a really IT-centric organization and building out tools like ONAP and software-defined networking and those kind of things. It'll be really interesting to see whether telco cultures can drag themselves from the old way of working to that new way of working. But it'll be fascinating to see.
Yeah, I mean, what is important here to add is if we talk about having hundreds of different software technologies, I mean, it is obvious that there is a change required because when you came from the operational point of view, which means you have many different departments, like you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, the field technicians, the customer reps, and just imagining you have a bunch of hundreds of different software solutions for different service that you are providing. So the awareness, I think, for the topic is really growing into the industry, especially because of the efficiency topic that telcos need to get more efficient, and that the OSS part is often like one of the barriers, let's call it this way, to address and to talk about. I mean, hundreds of solutions, thousands of people needing different access and different services. That is a huge complexity, and it's a really, really huge challenge for the operators to make a transition towards the efficiency topics. And maybe next to the efficiency, Ryan, what are some major forces you are mentioning? Like the pendulum is swinging back and forth between I build my own operating system, I'm really an IT company, and then maybe other part is like okay, I would like to buy out of the box, let's call it this way. Yeah, what are other major forces for the OSS topic next to the efficiency, or is efficiency important, and what are the major
Yeah,
forces here?
absolutely. Ultimately, that's what OSS are there for, is to help an organization run their business more efficiently. So I guess they had their origins in people were doing things more by manual attempts, and once the power of computing became more useful, because they're doing the same thing, like creating order activations so many times a day, thousands of times a day. It kind of makes sense to use the power of computing to automate those. So yeah, it's an interesting one. There's so many aspects that we can improve upon. And kind of touched on it a little bit with when we're talking about that many systems and that many people. I kind of equate it to one of the first principles of physics, and that's force equals mass by acceleration. So the only way you can get any form of acceleration or change when you're talking about a massive, massive object like some of the big tier one telcos, that so many systems, so many people, how do you establish change in that? And to get any acceleration at all requires an enormous force. So I guess part of my thinking is that, how do you look to decrease the mass upon which you're applying a force to? So a number of different ways of doing that. I kind of like the idea of getting some of the smaller teams. So I like the principles of agile coming in, where smaller teams have got more accountability, not so much bureaucracy. I think we've also just got so many unbelievably clever people working in this industry, and sometimes that actually counts against us because we've got so many clever people with so many ideas. We end up in analysis paralysis kind of thing. And by being able to break it into smaller teams, smaller modules, even that sort of microservices principle is, hopefully decreasing the mass upon which you're trying to apply a force.
Yeah, so the microservice architecture you mentioned, this is really, really something that is going on in the industry, that they are switching OSS topic towards microservices. And the IGL development style I also really like just having shorter segments of sprints or whatever, small teams. Yeah. And I mean, like you mentioned, hundreds of solutions means also hundreds of different involved peoples in every topic. So it creates a huge complexity. What I'm really interested in, Ryan, what is a typical challenge? Let's say for I would try to speak like about a concrete project. Let's say there's a tier 1 or tier 2 operator, and what are they asking you? Like, what is the typical consultant part that you make here?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it comes down to complexity. And so I guess that's almost what I see my role as a consultant is, partly is to unlock some of that complexity. And we've got so many really clever engineers in the industry that I tend to find that a lot of engineers really think about it as an engineering problem rather than a business problem. So how to sort of take a step back and turn that into a more of the business challenge to try and solve. But it's definitely an interesting one. And as a consultant, I guess I see myself as a connector. So to be able to connect ideas, people, projects, products, those kind of things. So a lot of, I guess, what I do is to bring those pieces together. So there's a particular business problem. Are we best off solving this with a process change or an org chart redesign, or is it capturing requirements and figuring out the best product to fit in here? Or so I guess the aspect of that means that that's part of why the Blue Book directory exists, is because of trying to stay abreast of what all the different products are out there. So I think that's where I probably help customers the most, is in trying to say, well, what's the best way forward? So because some of these decisions can be really complex, I've tried to systematize those things so that it becomes less qualitative and a little bit more quantitative. So that if you kind of follow the step-by-step approach, you go from, okay, I start with 450 vendors. How do I quickly get that down to 5? How do I quickly get that down to 1 or 2, so that I can really focus, say, do proof of concept just on 2 instead of 5 or 12 or whatever it is. So yeah, it's trying to bring more repeatability, more methodology into developing these things. And there are a lot of, so they tend to be very big, very complex, very risky. a lot of the things so if you take it up a few levels, I guess there is some repeatability in that. So part of the reason, passionate about OSS has got an octopus as part of the logo. And my thinking behind that is I kind of refer to OSS as the octopus. So it's got the 8 tentacles, and you think you've got all of the tentacles kind of under control, and then another one comes and whacks you on the back of the head. But there are some really common type of risks that I guess to really look out for, and that was part of what the book was about too. So it's listing, here are the potential pitfalls, here are the different ways of approaching things. Like even something like data migration, for example, is often overlooked. The vendors tend to know just how hard data migration can be, and also that quite a lot of that data collection and manipulation is outside their control. So often they tend to push the responsibility for that data migration onto the carriers, and that can be a really challenging thing for them. So yeah, I guess that was the idea of the book, is answering some of those questions.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you mentioned that there are like two different worlds, like the IT and the engineering world, where we both started from, like studying as an engineer, then coming to OSS projects, and then there's more like the business economy, and between them there needs to be somebody who, let's call it, translate the language, and it's great to have like or have you as an external advisor who can help also inside the company. That's what I understand, to maybe translate some of the topics. What are the tech guys speaking? What are the business unit looking forward? And I think this is a great way to have a journey like you have it, starting from an engineer and then coming into the business part and speaking both of the languages, which I think is an important aspect when we talk about transforming the OSS to have both of the perspectives of the pyramid, because it's not only the requirement, I think, is mostly coming from the economic part to change, and maybe also from the engineering, that it's complex, but I think there's a lot of translation work that needs to be done between these two departments, or these two segments.
Yeah. And you're spot on there, Torsten, too. So one of the things that I often refer to is tripods. So the people, having worked in a lot of different organizations, carriers, telco, vendors, integrators, the people who I've always found the most valuable within their organizations, but also just to speak with and to learn from and so forth, are tripods, in that they have a real business understanding. They have a real understanding of the technology, whether that be the IT and networks, but also, I guess, the operations of the business. And they can kind of bring those three legs of the tripod together and really bring a real context to how all of them fit. And they may not necessarily be an expert in any one of those fields, but exactly to your point, they act as the translator and bring the brilliant engineers who are the brilliant coders together. I was even having a conversation this morning about a similar thing, where you've got the data scientists coming through the industry and PhDs and really, really clever with the management of data and finding insights out of the data. But data itself doesn't really answer any question, doesn't really give you any answers unless you ask questions of it. And having those subject matter experts, the tripods, who understand the business context, can ask the right questions, but can also act as translator to a data scientist, who they understand enough about data science to talk the language of a data scientist, but also know enough about the business and the operations to say, yeah, how are all these pieces fitting together? So something that I definitely aspire to, having seen how valuable tripods have been in the organizations I've worked in.
Yeah, okay. Um, Something which I would also like to speak is maybe between the different challenges, or do you see, Ryan, different challenges of smaller to mid-size ISPs and then the big ones, or is it really like the same? We've talked about how the different perspectives of all the things that need to work together. Is in this respect anything different between a small operator, a big operator, or what do you think, Ryan? Or is it really like the same? Was it just complexity increasing, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I break it down into the large operators, the medium, so tier 2, tier 3 operators, ISPs, even a number of really large organizations. So I've worked for, like, for example, banking customers that have OSS because they have such wide corporate comms networks, but also carrier lease networks and so forth. And particularly, I guess, with more usage of cloud coming in as well. Yeah, I guess there's a number of different styles of users. The utility operators tend to have really big comms networks and have OSS. So each one have got their own real nuances. The big operators tend to have a lot more resources to play with, but they tend to be handling lots higher volume as well. So a lot higher volume of change. So I guess they have to look at a lot more automation and regulation and consistency about the processes they apply. With the smaller operators, I found that some of those actually got the best fit OSS for anybody, because, like, I've seen a few examples where the OSS has almost been built from scratch by a few individuals who've stayed at an ISP for a long period of time, progressively built more and more functionality. It's really, really highly attuned to their business. So brilliant at running their particular processes. It may struggle to translate to try and productionize that, or to turn that into a product and then take it to other customers, but it suits really well for them. But one of the things I've also found is probably the smaller operators would be a great place to start in a journey in the OSS industry. Working at a smaller company means you have to wear more hats. So you have to learn more about the different technologies and the processes and the all of the moving parts than you would in one of the big telcos. You tend to be really little pigeonholes where you get put. So the smaller operators, I've seen some great examples of having worked with the small guys and just seeing how they've spread their wings out and really made an impact with some of the bigger players as their career have developed. So yeah, I love seeing what the small guys do, and usually it's with a very, very small budget that they're doing that and solving the specific problems, where I guess the big guys have also got a lot of legacy, a lot of variance in their networks, in their service offerings, in their customer base. So they have to handle a lot, a much more tricky variant tree typically. Smaller guys can kind of prune down their variant tree and just do a smaller number of things, but do it really, really efficiently, really well. So yeah, it's an interesting one too, that the big guys probably would tend in most cases to do I'll call it best of breed, but usually it's like a patchwork quilt of all these different systems. Some cases that's true of the smaller guys too, but ideally the smaller guys would probably want I guess more of the modules to be all available in the one place, and not have to do dozens of integrations and manipulations of data and so forth. So I guess also one of the things is within the big telcos, they tend to have a lot of OSS experts there. So they've got the network experts, the OSS, the BSS, and all those pieces of the puzzle. Whereas often the smaller players, it's a little bit more of you've got the teams who are building the networks who also have to learn a little bit about OSS, or they have to solve problems with some OSS tools, but because they're so snowed under with that, they're not 100% OSS experts necessarily. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they have to wear multiple hats of being network experts as well as NMS, OSS, BSS, all of those things.
Yeah. Great. I mean, you said the smaller operators, they really like trying to build, or some of them trying to build the system really from scratch. This is also the same like we've done it, that we have no real fit here in the industry, let's call it this way, with the way how we are working and how we were developing. And this turns out to be the easiest step to build it by ourselves. And the bigger operators, of course, it's another level of complexity. But I guess it's also great from the smaller operators. I think there's a lot that also can the bigger operators learn, because, like you said, there are not many people involved who need to build these kind of systems, and they need to have a big overview of the technologies. I mean, many of the smaller operators are using also different technologies. Like, it's not that it's only let's call FTTH or something. They have all different technologies, and they have just a couple of guys sitting around that they need to address all the aspects and also the efficiency topic. So this is where really I also agree that there are like great systems built which are like all in one. And for the bigger operators, it's the puzzle with hundreds of different solutions. Of course, a different complexity level. But really interesting also for me to see every day the difference between how the industry is working. I mean, for the customer, he just gets into office and buys internet. But if you know the level of complexity which is behind it, this is really amazing, and this is really where I share the passion, Ryan.
Yeah.
Ryan, what I would like to speak about is maybe the future of OSS, or the future of OSS. The next 10 or 15 years, what would be your most appreciated scenario for OSS? In which direction should it move, or will it move? What do you see for trends here, Ryan?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, because there are so many threads to what an OSS is and what an OSS has to respond to, that I can't even really predict what's happening next week, let alone sort of 10 to 15 years out. Just even look at some of the fundamentals, like the changes that when I first started, it was basically relational databases and that was it. Now you've got dedicated time series, you've got dedicated graph databases, and in the OSS field, there's a perfect opportunity to use those things and many more. And the network technologies are changing so much. The one thing I'd love to see happen is for us to take a bit more of a, I guess, more of a simplistic, or try and reduce complexity, so that to be the number one target of what we're trying to achieve. Is there is so much inherent complexity both upstream of us. So when you're talking about a tier one telco, you're probably talking about 50 different services just within one class. So just for example, I worked at one of the tier one telcos here in Australia, where they had something like 55 different classes just of mobile service. So and each one of those has got a different BSS, a different setup, different orchestration, so many different variants that you have to handle. So some of those things are kind of upstream of us. We don't necessarily get to. Ideally, I'd like us to try and look to persuade some of the upstream systems and decisions and processes to try and narrow down that variant tree to prune some of the things. Like, did that organization need 55 different service variants for a mobile service? Probably not. They had their three main ones, but they just didn't want to cull a lot of the legacy or grandfathered offerings. And I can kind of understand that too, because that potentially means those customers are then pushed into a re-evaluation and potentially churn. But at the same time, they're probably not necessarily thinking, they're looking at the immediate revenue, but what's the cost of running that service further downstream of those decisions. But some of the decisions that are within our locus of control, that we also do a lot of complexity. And It's amazing. I have probably a few thousand connections in the OSS world, but I only know two that are CX experts or UX experts. So there's very, very few organizations that I've had experience with who actually put time into really putting a UX expert into designing their interfaces. So I tend to find that a lot of our OSS tools are not intuitive to try and somebody new. So even I can remember one scenario where I've had experience with quite a few of these tools and kind of know the use cases that they're generally needing to do. But if it takes me a month to really get up to speed and be able to drive some of these solutions, then clearly there's a challenge with that user interface or the workflows or things like that. So I'd love to see some more of those vendors invest a bit more time into the user experience. And that can manifest in a few different ways. So, for example, if you look at Apple and Johnny Ive and the kind of way they've changed the MP3 market to the usability of an iPod, that comes about through trialing thousands of different variations, I guess, trying different ways of doing things. But in my experience working inside the vendors, it's, oh, we've got a function to solve for. All right, here's my first attempt at it. Okay, I've solved it. It now passes test cases. Move on, because I've got this huge big bucket of other functions that I have to solve for. We don't. Those people who are solving those functional problems don't get time to go and play with 50, 100 different variations of how that user experience might look, and how do we look to simplify those things. So that's probably one of the things that I guess I'd love to see it. And also closely related to that, I look at the long tail. So if you look at functionality within an OSS, it's some of the functionality is in every single vendor. So let's say it's a performance management solution. Every performance management solution can do function A, B, C, D. Everybody's got it because it's the really big ticket item. But then I tend to find that to differentiate from all the other performance management tools, it's more like the other long end of the tail, the stuff that it isn't really as important or as influential. That stuff at the long end of the tail, that's where people are focusing their effort, their marketing, their differentiation strategies, as opposed to coming back to what are the things that really move the needle, make those really, really efficient. So if I look at a vendor selection process, often it's well, can you do function A, B, C, D, E? Yes, tick, 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 tick. Okay, you've done all those. But if you're doing that one function 1,000 times a day, it makes a really big difference whether it takes 1 minute to do that function versus another vendor can also do it, but they're taking 10 minutes to do that function. So I guess I'd love to see the 80-20 rule applied, where we kind of come back to those use cases that have been around for 40 years, those really fundamental use cases, and the use cases that the customers use hundreds and hundreds of times a day. Come back and revisit those and say, well, how can we do that more efficiently? How can we enable that at bulk? How can we streamline the process, the design, the data model, all those aspects that come into making something more user-friendly on the really high volume stuff, as opposed to the long end of the tail that might be used once every 2 months or something.
Yeah. So let me try to sum up. You said like trying to reduce complexity is really important for the future OSS, to make it like from hundreds of solutions maybe to a handful. Then you said like having a better graphical user interface, and the speed topic, which I totally agree that it's important to have the processes running fast. And I think from an graphical user interface view, it's also important to have like a full end-to-end analysis available, so that every part of the team is capable to get these processes or the information who is required really fast. So complexity, efficiency we have talked about is important, and the graphical user interface, which I would like to call end-to-end view, and speed, of course, is also really an important topic. Did I forgot something, Ryan, from your perspective?
Yeah, so I guess one of the other things is I guess to an extent standardization. So to really reduce that integration tax, and I, I'm a bit of an evangelist of what the TM Forum does in trying to attempt to be able to standardize some of those things. So I like the concept of what they're trying to achieve with open APIs and what they've already achieved with frameworks. So the application map and SID and ETOM and those kind of things. That it's a tough one because there are so many nuances. Every carrier is different the way they do things. Every vendor is different the way they do things. But they are trying to achieve a really difficult challenge. So one of the things I'd love to see is buy-in. A lot of the vendors have already bought into the fact of trying to standardize. And I noticed they've just recently come up with a concept of a kind of lab environment, an open lab environment where different vendors can actually come in and trial and integrate and try and get things working. So I don't know a lot of the details around that program just yet, but in concept, I love the idea of it and improving the interoperability that would potentially bring. And so I guess to sum up a little bit, I love a comment by Ramit Sethi who basically says, well, people pay for two things. So one is, I guess, results, and the other is convenience. And in the OSS industry, sometimes we tend to get a bit carried away with the technology and not really focus on, what are the results? What are the things that really make a difference for not just our customers, so not just servicing the needs of a carrier's operators, for example, but how we then impact the results that they're getting with their end customers, and thinking, how can we add value to the end customers? So the customer's customers, not just the customer. The other one we kind of talked about is convenience. Comes in a number of different ways. So being able to do things that they can't do for themselves, or be able to make things that are really difficult a lot easier for them to do. So results and convenience are probably the objective, almost the mindset to go in with to OSS rather than the technology per se.
Yeah, okay, great that you add this part of the puzzle. Also interesting that you mentioned the open API or library approach that we try to, which is also trying to reduce complexity and to make it more easier to use.
And standardization across different vendors.
Yeah. Okay. What I also see is that there are new technologies or future technologies involving which, of course, operators are interesting to use. I mean, IoT is not really new, but many operators are getting this stuff on board and already having them. And I mean, there are more devices, new technologies. 5G is actually really a big part, which makes a lot of the stuff which I came across from researching, that 5G really gives a kick-off to OSS innovation. Ryan, is there something that you would like to add? I have on my paper that you have you called it call for innovation. So I guess this is what we speak now, or is there something that you would like to add here?
Well, it's interesting too that you raise. So before we get to that, so to talk about 5G, so one of the things I've tended to find is, so if you follow the money, that's where the exciting projects will tend to be. And it seems like some of the big investments that are coming are in IoT, that kind of concept of bringing digital twin, which OSS is a digital twin for a telco, but bringing digital twin to industry, and I guess also making more use of cloud offerings. So yeah, I guess where the money goes, the projects, the interesting projects go. So for people like us who want to play around with some interesting projects, I guess that's where I see some of the next few years at least. But yeah, I guess the call for innovation was something that I wrote a couple of years ago now, and so the OSS industry, I just marvel at the number of so many clever people who work in this industry. There's so many amazing things that we've achieved, and yet there's still so many opportunities. It's just so many opportunities to improve not only our tools but also the outcomes for our customers. So yeah, there's so many problems we still need to solve for. So the call for innovation was just something that I wrote up that talked about. So how can what would, I almost use the analogy, a few years ago, one of the big vendors bought one of the other big vendors for over $1 billion. And to me, I found that an interesting scenario because for that $1 billion, yes, they got some projects and customers and so forth, but they also got a technology that was probably 20 years old at that stage. And I kind of thought, well, I'd love to see that $1 billion instead go into, well, what's the next generation of OSS going to look like that's not going to be hamstrung by millions and millions of man hours that's already been pre-built. So pros and cons, millions of man hours have gone into it, but based on really old technology. So it was almost like the use cases haven't really changed in 30 or 40 years. The underpinning technologies have, but yeah, the call for innovation was more about how to potentially look at things differently and looking at I guess just things like just looking over here at a list of things that were written down in the call for innovation, and so things like the user interfaces we've talked about, but I'd love to see a more almost a Google style ability to interact with the data that our OSS collects, to be able to have a more simple query. So rather than when we look at a typical OSS, it's probably got your list down the left-hand side and it's got boxes here, boxes here. It's got millions and millions of menus. I'd love to see something that's a little bit more simple, which becomes like a query, not necessarily a natural language type query, but something more queryable so that we can readily get access to the data, particularly for if we're going to add value to the execs and CFO, CMO, marketing team, sales team, all these other teams, is to make these tools more accessible. So you don't have to do an OSS apprenticeship to be able to get insight out of what we're collecting. So yeah, we've talked about a few of the other things like a more simplified integration mechanism. We talked a little bit about an open source core, simplification, transparency of documentation. One of the things is, I think, part of why Cisco had been really successful over the last 20 or 30 years is partly the CCX type training, that so many people became trained in Cisco technologies and therefore became evangelists, advocates. They would sell what they know. So Cisco kind of developed this big pool of salespeople who weren't even on their books as a salesperson, but also the fact that they put so much documentation out there that people could self-serve a lot. I don't see a lot of that from the OSS vendors. It's you get the products, but how to then get up to speed with them, the use of documentation, and I guess also you look at something like YouTube and how when you have a problem to try and resolve, Google or YouTube. So how to resolve it, YouTube actually shows you a video of how to achieve things. Kind of haven't really seen as much of that built into the tool sets that we use. So yeah, maybe some ideas there for the vendors to take away is how to make that barrier to entry, how to get people up to speed with the tools and the problems more easily, how to overcome the barrier.
Yeah, that is also my impression from the industry. I mean, it's changing a little bit, but I totally agree that it's often not this public available what they are doing. I mean, for many companies, you're not even able to see how the graphical user interface looks like. So this is just like, okay, here's my landing page and just contact me. Or I mean, it's of course it's a little bit better, but if you compare it to like really the innovative companies you are talking about, the big names and other big software projects, I agree on that it's not this easy to get in. And the example of Cisco is really great, that with the experts they've built by themselves, that they've been really successful on this part. Yeah, Ryan, I think we are more than an hour online. It was really great. My biggest concern in the beginning was that the passion between for the OSS topic is endless. So I think we need to make a cut here. We both really share the passion here. Ryan, my last question is, if anybody wants to get in contact with you and get your book get in contact with you, how should this work out?
Yeah, so maybe just jump over to passionateaboutoss.com, and there's some contact forms over there on the website. So that's probably one of the best ways, or reach out on LinkedIn. I'm quite active on LinkedIn. I find that a really invaluable way. I've talked a little bit earlier about being a connector, and I guess use LinkedIn quite heavily to stay in touch with different parts of the OSS industry. So it's it might be 10 years ago that I last worked with somebody on a project, and thought, oh, they've actually been through 4 or 5 different organizations since then. How am I going to find them? They've changed email address and so forth. And find LinkedIn really valuable to stay in touch, and also to reach out and make those connections with vendors, integrators, telcos, and just share the story like we have today. I love talking about it. We've gone well over an hour, but I'm sure we could go 5, 10, 15 hours talking about the topic. Yeah, it's a bit crazy.
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. Today I will end the podcast different. So stay sure that you get this book. Stay sure to follow Ryan on the Passionate About OSS website. I will put all the links in the video. They're really amazing blogs that you have wrote. It's really great. And thanks for watching. Click a thumbs up if you like the content. And like Ryan, you mentioned, I think we will have a second podcast to speak about the OSS topic and to share the passion with our viewers. So thanks, Ryan.
Fantastic, and look forward to speaking to all the viewers out there as well. And thanks for sitting down and chatting with me. It's been great fun. Look forward to doing it again. Thanks,
Great.
Dawson.